There is a chemical in your body right now that your body cannot remove. It arrived there through food. Through the wrapper, the food came in. Through decades of contact between hot grease and a coating engineered to resist everything, including the biological processes that would normally clear a foreign compound from human tissue. Denmark looked at that compound in 2019. They looked at what it did. They banned it from all food packaging on July 1st, 2020. Burger wrappers, pizza boxes, French fry containers, gone. The United States has never passed a law prohibiting it, not because the science is different here. The science is the same. DuPont's own scientists documented in 1980 that this compound crosses the placenta. It accumulates in the tissue of unborn children. The company continued selling it for food packaging applications for decades after that internal finding. The FDA was not informed. Your children, if you have them, were exposed before they were born. That is not speculation. That is a finding from the company's own internal records, surfaced decades later in litigation. By the end of this video, you will know the exact mechanism that kept this compound in contact with American food for more than 50 years, which federal approvals remain technically valid today, despite the announcement made in 2024, and what one man discovered in 2014 when he paid for his own water tests because no government agency paid for them on his behalf. $110 million was spent lobbying against federal regulation of these compounds between 2019 and 2022. 130 bills were introduced. 4 became law. And in February 2024, the industry announced a voluntary phase-out. Most outlets called it a resolution. What they did not report is what a voluntary phase-out actually means in legal terms, and what the approvals that have been on the books since 1967 still permit today. That is what this video is about. Per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, a family of more than 14,000 synthetic compounds, are built on a single chemical principle, the bond between carbon and fluorine atoms. That bond is the strongest bond in organic chemistry. It repels oil. It repels water. It repels heat. It repels biological breakdown. This is why a hamburger wrapper coated with these compounds stays intact when grease from a hot patty presses against it. The bond holds. The same property that makes the wrapper work makes the compound permanent. It does not degrade in soil. It does not degrade in water. It does not metabolize in the human body. It accumulates in the liver, in the blood plasma, in fatty tissue, and it stays. In 2017, researchers at the Silent Spring Institute, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Environmental Working Group collected more than 400 samples of food packaging from 27 fast food chains across the United States. Nearly half of all paper wrappers tested, burger wrappers, pastry bags, sandwich sleeves, contained fluorine, the chemical marker for these compounds. 20% of paperboard containers, including French fry boxes, tested positive as well. Peer-reviewed research has linked prolonged exposure to altered thyroid hormone function, liver damage, immune system suppression, elevated cholesterol, reduced vaccine effectiveness, and adverse reproductive outcomes. The liver is the primary accumulation organ. The compounds reach a developing fetus through the umbilical cord. DuPont's internal scientists confirmed that last finding in 1980. The company continued manufacturing the compound for food packaging applications for decades afterward. The FDA was not informed of that finding until long after the fact. In 1966, DuPont submitted an application to the Food and Drug Administration to use its grease-resistant coating on food wrappers. Internal FDA toxicologists reviewed the submission. Dogs and rats fed the coating for 3 months had developed enlarged livers. The toxicologists requested a 2-year health study before approval. The FDA approved the application in 1967. 1 year later, in 1968, the FDA approved a separate application from the company, then called the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, known today as 3M, to use their version of these compounds in food packaging. In 1970, that approval was expanded to cover additional food types. In the same decade those approvals were issued, internal studies at 3M and DuPont first documented accumulation of these compounds in the blood of their own employees. Those studies were not provided to the FDA. In 1975, DuPont communicated to 3M that the compound showed signs of toxicity. Neither company communicated that finding to the FDA. The FDA had already approved the compound for direct food contact years earlier. In 1987, DuPont discovered its product was migrating into food at levels more than 3 times what the FDA had approved. DuPont did not report this to the FDA. In 1999, the Environmental Protection Agency and 3M independently confirmed that these compounds were appearing in blood banks across the country. In 2000, 3M voluntarily announced it would stop producing its version of the compound. The FDA did not act on the remaining approved uses until 2008. That is 32 years between the first internal documentation of accumulation in human blood and the first federal regulatory response, a gap of 32 years, during which the approvals remained in effect, during which the compound continued to contact food served to hundreds of millions of Americans. Between 2002 and 2016, the FDA approved 19 new versions of these compounds for use in food packaging. These shorter chain versions were described by manufacturers as safer than their predecessors, compounds that would not accumulate in the body the way the earlier versions had. In 2018, FDA scientists published a study showing that one of the most widely used short-chain versions, called 6.2 fluorotelomere alcohol, does not clear the body the way manufacturers had claimed. It accumulates in liver, fat tissue, and blood plasma. It persists for more than a year in animal studies. In 2020, the FDA published 2 additional studies confirming those findings and concluding the compound was significantly more toxic than industry submissions had indicated. 4 manufacturers voluntarily agreed to phase out that short-chain version in 2020. Who decided that the voluntary phase-out of one short-chain version was a sufficient regulatory response, given that the same cycle had already completed once before with the long-chain versions, producing the same result? No federal statute answers that question. In February 2024, the FDA announced that these compounds were no longer being sold in the United States for use in food packaging. The coverage was largely positive. The problem, many outlets suggested, had been resolved. Here is what the announcement did not say. The phase-out was voluntary. No law required it. The regulatory approvals the FDA issued for these compounds, approvals dating to 1967, remain technically in effect. A manufacturer choosing to reintroduce these compounds to food packaging would face no federal statute prohibiting that decision. In January 2025, the FDA formally noted that 35 food contact notifications related to these compounds were no longer effective because the manufacturers had ceased production voluntarily. The approvals were not revoked. The manufacturers stopped. Those are not the same thing. Environmental Defense Fund scientists responded directly to that distinction. FDA continued to authorize new compounds for food contact uses until as recently as 2019, concluding those uses were safe, the same conclusion the agency had reached about 6.2 fluorotellumer alcohol before its own scientists proved otherwise. In contrast, Denmark implemented its ban in July 2020 under Order Number 681, covering the entire class of compounds regardless of chain length. No individual substance review, no voluntary commitment, a legal prohibition. Before the ban, the Danish Food Safety Authority had found these compounds in nearly half of all paper food packaging on the Danish market. After the ban, the food packaging industry developed compliant alternatives. Research from Denmark's Technical University National Food Institute found no significant increase in packaging costs. The European Union's Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, published in January 2025 and taking full legal effect in August 2026, will extend that prohibition across all 27 member states. Any food packaging with individual compound concentrations above 25 parts per billion, combined concentrations above 250 parts per billion, or total fluorine from these sources above 50 parts per million will be barred from the European market. 14 American states have passed their own legislation. 36 have not. In the states that have passed laws, compliance is self-reported by manufacturers. No mandatory federal testing of food packaging before market entry exists anywhere in the United States. The American Chemistry Council spent $58.7 million lobbying on these compounds between 2019 and 2022. 8 manufacturers spent an additional $55.7 million. Of 130 related bills introduced in Congress during those 4 years, 4 became law. The Keep Food Containers from PFAS Act, which would give the FDA authority to designate these compounds in any food containers as unsafe, has been introduced and reintroduced in Congress. It has not passed. You are somewhere familiar. A highway rest stop, an airport terminal, a strip mall at lunch hour. You are hungry, and there is one reasonable option. You order. The wrapper arrives warm. The grease from the food inside has already begun to soften the paper from the inside. The box holding the fries has a surface engineered specifically to resist that process, to hold together, to not fail, to keep the contents from soaking through. You do not think about the wrapper. There is nothing on the wrapper to think about. No label, no disclosure, no regulatory requirement that any of this appear in writing anywhere you can see it. You eat, you fold the wrapper, you throw it away. In your liver, compounds from this meal and previous meals, previous wrappers, previous boxes, previous years are present. They did not metabolize. The bond that makes them useful in packaging is the same bond that makes them permanent in biological tissue. Your body has no mechanism to break it. In Petersburg, New York, a woman named Emily Marp tested her family's blood after learning that the nearby town of Hoosick Falls had discovered these compounds in its water supply. Her children's levels came back above 100 and 200 parts per billion, respectively. The threshold above which potential harmful effects begin is 2 parts per billion. Her own levels were higher. She had not worked in a factory. She had not lived near a known contamination site. She was a resident of a small town in upstate New York. In Denmark, someone in the same situation, same rest stop, same hunger, same time of day, is eating from a wrapper that has contained none of these compounds since July 1st, 2020. Same food, different regulatory decision, different wrapper. The food tastes identical. Autonomy looks like knowing the difference. In 2013, John Hickey died of kidney cancer in Hoosick Falls, New York. He had worked at the local Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics manufacturing plant for 32 years. He had been retired for 7 months. His son Michael noticed something after the funeral. A local teacher died in her 50s. Others followed. He started asking what connected them. He identified the water. In 2014, he collected samples from the village supply and paid for laboratory analysis out of his own pocket. Results showed elevated levels of perfluorooctanoic acid, a long-chain member of the same compound family used in food packaging. State testing later confirmed concentrations as high as 600 parts per trillion in the Hoosick Falls water supply. The source was traced to the Saint-Gobain plant, which had used the compound in manufacturing processes. It had entered the groundwater. Residents had been drinking it for decades without any notification. Researchers from Bennington College subsequently conducted a door-to-door health survey of Hoosick Falls and neighboring communities. Across 443 responses, they documented 31 cases of kidney cancer, 11 cases of testicular cancer, 231 cases of thyroid disease, and 71 cases of ulcerative colitis. The New York State Department of Health conducted its own study and found no statistically significant increase in cancers within the village boundary over a 20-year period. The Bennington College researchers noted that the state study did not interview any residents and did not collect data on several disease categories linked to compound exposure. The contradiction between those two findings has not been resolved. In 2022, Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics, 3M, and Honeywell settled a class action lawsuit covering Hoosick Falls for $65 million. The settlement included 10 years of medical monitoring for residents with elevated compound levels. Neither company admitted liability. Hickey's case was not a food packaging case. The contamination came from industrial discharge into groundwater, but the compound belongs to the same family. The accumulation mechanism is identical. The body's inability to clear it is identical. The only difference is the dose and the route of entry. The question Michael Hickey asked in 2013, "Why does everyone here seem to be getting sick?" is the same question the FDA's own toxicologists were asking in 1966 when they reviewed an application and found enlarged livers in dogs and rats. The toxicologists asked for more time. The application was approved 11 months later. What you can do today, specifically, check whether your state has passed legislation restricting these compounds in food packaging. California's Assembly Bill 1200, signed October 2021 and in effect January 2023, is the most comprehensive state-level model. Washington State passed the first such law in 2018. Maine, Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, Minnesota, New York, and Vermont have followed. If your state is not on that list, your state legislature is the relevant body. The representatives who have introduced and blocked related bills are on public record. The bills are searchable by name. The food packaging industry in Denmark demonstrated in 2020 that compliant alternatives exist, are technically viable, and do not significantly raise costs. That demonstration has been public for 5 years. A federal prohibition that makes voluntary commitments unnecessary has not been introduced with sufficient support to pass. Every approval issued since 1967 remains technically valid. Every voluntary phase-out can be reversed by a business decision. The same cycle has completed twice. Long-chain compounds approved, found harmful, phased out, replaced by short-chain compounds described as safer, found harmful, phased out, with no federal statute preventing a third iteration. $110 million in lobbying across 4 years produced 4 laws from 130 bills. That ratio is not an accident of legislative process. 10 years from now, your neighbors may be eating from wrappers manufactured under the same standard that has applied since 1967, assuming voluntary commitments have held, assuming no third substitution cycle has begun, assuming the approvals that remain on the books have not been acted upon. You will know what those assumptions rest on. You will know what the 2024 announcement did and did not accomplish. You will know what Michael Hickey found when he paid for his own answers, because no institution paid for them on his behalf. If this opens something for you, if you want to understand the next system built on the same architecture of voluntary compliance, technically valid approvals, and regulatory gaps measured in decades, subscribe. This channel follows the money, the documents, and the timeline. Every time. Share this with someone who heard the 2024 announcement and assumed the problem was solved. The announcement was real. What it left intact is the story.